well, for me anyway. And I just wanted to say we're starting a little late. The three of us were at the Chamber's breakfast meeting where Mayor Feelgood gave the State of the City address. And it was, he gave a wonderful speech. The Chamber was enthralled. And so that's why we're starting a little late. Good morning again. So let's start with roll call.
Chairperson Rusing.
Here.
Member Montoya.
Here.
Member Sischke.
Here.
All are present.
Finally.
Yes. And public comment will be accepted following each agenda item and is limited to 3 to 5 minutes. Please complete a comment card and return it to the city clerk. Speakers will be called in the order received. Item 4, discussion and action items. Approval of the February 1st, 2022 meeting minutes. Has everyone had a chance to review any changes?
I saw no changes.
Okay, thank you.
I move we accept, Chair.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, we're going to move on to item 4B, water service application number WSA 21-0117, submitted by Chamberlain Development, Prescott LLC, on behalf of property owner JCI Investments LLC, location APM 106-40001N North. And it's approximately 322 acres. Property is in the north one half of Section 4 Township, et cetera, et cetera. Let's start the discussion. Thank you, Gwen.
Good morning, Chairman and members of the committee. So the item before you is not new. We looked at it in August of 2021. It's for the Hidden Hills subdivision. I've put a map up on the screen that kind of gives you the general vicinity. So this is Willow Creek Road right here. This is Pioneer Parkway. And this is the Pinion Oaks subdivision. So this property is actually west of the Pinion Oaks subdivision and north of Pioneer Parkway. Just pull up another map here. So as I mentioned, in August of last year, water was approved for this development for 151 lots. The developer has come back and asked for an additional 20 lots, which are highlighted here in yellow on the map, these lots right here. There are actually 21 when you count them, but the overall density of the development is an increase of 20 lots within the subdivision. The applicant submitted for a revision to their preliminary plat for Hidden Hills Phase 1. And this went to the Planning and Zoning Commission on February the 24th. The original water demand was 25.67 acre feet a year. These additional 20 lots will add 3.40 acre feet a year to the total development for a total water estimated use of 29.07 acre feet per year. As I mentioned, this went to the Planning and Zoning Commission on February the 24th with a recommendation of approval with a vote of 4 to 1. It is part of the procedural pre-annexation agreement for Deep Well. Under that agreement, they are allowed to build 10,500 dwelling units. To date, they have 718 dwelling units platted. With this additional 20, they'll be at 738 dwelling units. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have, and the applicant is here today as well.
Okay, thank you. Gwen, what was the reason for the amendment?
Perhaps the applicant would like to address that question.
Good morning, Vic Chapman. The reason for the additional cul-de-sac that you see here compared to the original one was that we had an excessive amount of export dirt, so it was approximately 200,000 yards. So instead of exporting that dirt, we decided to fill in that area and create a new cul-de-sac with some additional lots.
Okay, so, because I see, it looks like there was a wash or a ravine in the area,
Correct. There still is. This was a larger, wider one.
because stormwater runoff is a big issue when you put in a new subdivision, and are there any plans for engineering the runoff?
Oh, yeah, it's completely been engineered. That pass-through is still there.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions from anybody? I also, Gwen, have noticed that on your plat, is that an easement that's going through this amendment? This dotted line here?
George is nodding his head yes. George Worley with planning.
Hi, George.
How are you? Good morning.
My life.
The line you're pointing at, the dash line that runs diagonally from the southeast to the northwest, is a high tension power line easement.
Okay.
WAPA.
Okay, thank you. All right. So originally, the water allocated for this plat was 25.6?
25.67 acre feet for 151 lots
Okay, and we're increasing it today?
by 20 lots to 171 lots total.
So is that it looks like on the memo it says that's a 3.4 acre feet per
An
year.
additional
correct?
3.4 acre feet, yes.
When that water comes from the total for Deep Well Ranch, right? And it has already been under contract.
That's correct. It's under the procedural pre-annexation agreement for Deep Well Ranch.
And will the homes be having any rainwater harvesting systems installed?
There's no code requirement for that, to my knowledge, no.
Okay. All righty, is there any comments from the public?
No, there are none.
Okay, any more comments? Okay. Do I hear a motion?
Mayor, I move we forward WSA 21-017 to council for approval.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, thank you. We're now moving down to agenda item C, focus topic, 2022 draft water management policy. We're going to look at policy number 11 through 14 in regards to the water budget. And this item is for discussion only.
Good morning, Subcommittee. Hope you're having a good day. First day of spring, as you noted. I think to start with this topic, I had been asked by Gwen to assist with some discussion that was being had about water budget itself and how to work through this process here. So Gwen's been writing quite a bit of the policy using a 2018 policy that we had at one time. And so now it's time to look at that a little bit more closely and figure out how you're going to integrate your different tools, basically. So your customer contact point, your tracking of the water supply, how you're going to move these projects through and understand what you really have in front of you at the same time. So the only way I could think to do this with the group was sometimes you have to learn, you have to go back and understand what you knew at one time and see how it applies to the present. So we're going to go through how the city started allocating water supplies, and we're going to move really fast because there's a lot of slides, and hopefully get you to a point where you can say, okay, I see how things changed over time, and now we're looking at our future options. And hopefully that sets the stage for figuring out how you want to an amount, what will be subtracted, what will be the number you subtract from as you're allocating more water out, and how those tools might work together. So we'll just start zipping through. This is the actual language right now within the policy that I understand as of 2018. And so you're looking at a policy 11 through 14. The first one, of course, speaks about biannual budgeting. So your question is, how do you determine the volume the city has to budget? So if you don't know what's left, then how do you know what you can start subtracting from and where you might need to use it? Also, if there's any portions that need to be held in reserve. So you need to be thinking about that potentially too. Policy 12 and 13, this is where the blanks are at in the policy. So how much acre feet per year should be allocated to those different user types? And then last, this is from old policy that no single residential water service application, you say water service agreement application, will be approved that estimates water usage greater than 50% of the remaining biannual budget. So this is something that we had in the past. Looks like the city would like to try this again and see how it proves out to work.
Chair, can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Just to clarify, Leslie, are we talking about the water budgeting for residential and commercial, or is it just merely residential today? Or the whole thing?
It's the whole thing. So
Okay,
if
I just want to make sure that I understood.
Right, and I think our hope was that we could line up some possible recommendations you might want to bring forward, but you might just give us the go-ahead to work some more and see what makes sense after you walk through this a little bit more.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Oh no, here we go. The crazy mouse. Okay, so in the beginning, how did this all pan out? What happened? So in 1999, the area was declared out of safe yield. The language within that document says no longer at safe yield, and water providers in future subdivisions which apply to the department for an assured water supply will be required to acquire renewable water to meet the subdivision's needs. So this is the stance the city took. They looked at this language, and it's very evident over the years that I've been working on this and trying to unravel some of where you're at. This was important because we had councils previous to you that were asking, well, how much is left? What can we do? How are we going to make this all work? So this is your starting point. This is where the city started at. Also in the beginning, you had your first decision order come out. And so if you were going to use renewable supplies, the city was looking at budgeting this volume. We'll look at groundwater a little bit closer later, but the gist of that was the city took in every single subdivision that they knew of, and you remember this is a time where GIS wasn't as strong. You knew you had existing customers, you knew you had existing commitments. You also knew that we had this, what was called a pre-1998 plat rush, and that you could get additional groundwater supplies. And so your key one in this area is Prescott Lakes. That master plan was made possible through portion was already on groundwater, a portion could go seek more groundwater. So looking at this 1085, the city adopted a first water policy. So I just clipped out some pieces so you could see what it looked like at the time. But the key information is that of the 1,085 of renewable supplies, the city chose to make 1,000 acre feet available for new residential growth. The volume of the supply budget each year was as follows. So we pulled this right out of the old water policy. And what it looked at was each year it said, okay, well, single family, they front loaded pretty seriously, 380 acre feet. And then the multifamily, they said 40. And then you can see how that tracks through. And they knew their accounting. Basically, they said, okay, this is how we're going to do it. They also were looking at an allocation of 0.36 because this is what was in the city's decision order, how they figured out a volume for the groundwater portion. And so they wanted to follow suit. There were a couple amendments. You can see those happening up here to this policy. And they said, oh, wait a minute. I think we're much different than, it's great. There's statutes that say how water is going to be compiled and put into a DNO, Decision Order of Assured Water Supply. Sorry, I'll try not to use the acronyms. And they said, you know what, we need to break this down a little bit more. We need 0.35 for single family potential and 0.25 for multifamily. Okay, and I think there's probably another key here that's important, is that the city, I think at this time, excuse me, worked under the assumption that only residential subdivisions needed to have an assured water supply. So in the interim, you were having commercial subdivisions come in, but it wasn't part of the discussion. So we kind of found that as we were cleaning over the years. So then what happens next? We have a second decision in order, and this is where the city starts bringing in their surface water supply from their Chino Valley Irrigation District, IGA. So they're still looking at allocating based on this block here. They're holding this one steady because they knew they had people who had infill coming in. They knew they had these pre-1998 plats, and they were working under the process or the chosen path at the time of the area's out of safe yield, and we are going to follow what the state's recommending and saying, okay, grow on alternative or renewable supplies. So this is where the block changes and it starts breaking down what it looks like. And I think that you've been through this quite a bit. So I built these graphics a long time ago so we could have easy, clear conversations about what your portfolio looks like and how it came to be. At the time, we were watching this, and we said, okay, the groundwater allowance could increase up to 11,200. So we kept tracking this to see how things were going. So the city adopts a second water policy. So this is similar to the first one, was for 5 years. So you can see the breakout here. They knew where they were at. They said, okay, we allocated 1,000. We put this much into contracts, leaving a remaining allocation. They knew they didn't put forward all their supplies. They held some 85 acre feet in reserve. And then they had some assured water supply increases, so groundwater allowance. Bottom line, the calculation came out, okay, city, looks like you have 1,770, I think that's a 5 there, 0.31. So they were carefully monitoring this, and the key points from this is that they determined 1,775 acre feet is available for budgeting using carryover, unused, and new supplies that they were bringing in. The volume of the supply, they followed the same path. They allocated certain amounts each year, and they moved things around a little bit. Instead of saying single family and multifamily, they went to a market and workforce. And so they knew that they were having challenges with having homes built that could meet the needs of starting teachers, firemen. Those are your workforce housing, typically, is how the city's looked at it over the years when I read the records. So they wanted to see if they could make sure they held a volume of water to encourage that kind of growth in the area.
Excuse me, Leslie.
Chair, thank you. I just want to ask a clarification question here, Leslie. When we're looking at these numbers on these tables, is that that was what the council allocated as available, or what was actually used, or do we know if there's a distinction between those two?
There is. So because you were using, okay, so this table is straight out of the policy at the time. Staff had to come in and show the council where things are at. How much remains available in the portfolio if you're following a renewable supplies growth pattern, how much has been put in contract. So the city had a pretty distinct practice starting in 1999 with a water service agreement application. That application would go through the process. It would become a contract. The contract would then have a volume, and the volume could be tracked in an accounting budgeting manner. So did I get your question? Or are we going to work on it a little bit more?
I guess what I'm getting at is and I'm specifically looking at this table, like the green table that it kind of shows the year by year. So I guess my question is it looks like, for instance, 2006 there was 160, and then for market, and then 40 for workforce / affordable, for a total of 200. Was that 200 getting used every year? Or do we know?
Pretty close. So I think I see the distinction you're trying to make now.
Yeah.
So we have this table where the city's like, okay, where do we stand so we know how to potentially budget into the future? And then they worked into their policy, this is how we're going to budget into the future. So these weren't expended at the time, they were available to allocate.
Right.
And then as we keep moving forward, I can show you how the city kept tracking
Okay.
and subtracting.
So but what I hear you saying is this budget was established and more or less every year we were kind of coming up to 200.
Generally so, yeah. I have a few more slides that are a few pages ahead.
Okay.
I think that will help.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that, Councilman Montoya, I think that we need to understand that at the time, it was being allocated at 0.35.
Right.
And so, yeah, basically, that's twice the amount of what we're doing, or
Yeah.
what we're looking at now. So yes, it wouldn't surprise me if 200 acre feet were an allocation that got used.
Yeah, and I just, like I said, for my own clarity, I mean, I was here in Prescott then, but I think for part of that, I was in high school, so.
And also, Member Montoya, here on the chart up there, it shows that the initial allocation for 99 was at 1,000 acre feet. And right below it says total water allocated through 2005 was 868.05. So there's to your answer. Was it all allocated? It was not. So there was that 130.9 there that was not allocated. And again, difference between allocated and truly used. Leslie will get to that in later slides, and that's where the worm comes into play today. But the budget, and see then in the green chart, that's then where budget comes in. So that was the new budget amount considered for allocation. But again, it was not all allocated.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that clarification, Craig and Leslie.
Right, we're moving through history pretty quick here. And so the terms that were used at one time was, it became contingency. I was trying to be careful about how much time I spend on this, but please ask questions when something doesn't seem to make sense. So this was a contingency, it was carried forward, made available. Same thing down here is the city was still working from a 0.35 for single family, 0.25 for multifamily. And as you probably heard over time, there was always 1/10 of an acre foot included in that volume because we wanted to be able to take care of support services. And that seemed to work fairly well for the city. So if it wasn't a commercial subdivision, and as I said, the city kind of missed some steps back in time, I could see when we were cleaning things up over time, as there should have been some action related to a commercial subdivision from the ADWR point of view. And so we knew that we could have other things like that, and we were very careful with the groundwater portion in case we needed to flex that block a little bit to cover things that were unforeseen. If you can imagine, it was a scramble in 1999. It was a pretty intense time when you're declared out a safe yield and the city's saying, okay, we're going to go into a designation. We want to show that we have the supplies we need for our community. We want to be ready for that future growth. We want to be able to support the commercial support services over time. But what I didn't get here, and I will jump back, is then CVID came into play. And so the city has documentation over time that 0.25, they were going to take their multifamily value and put that 0.25 acre feet per acre was the plan. And that's how contracts were going out. So when a CVID customer came in from the IGA, that we could recognize them, we calculated, okay, that's you have 1 acre of land, you get 0.25. And generally that process worked over time. Lots of nuances though that happen, but unfortunately we just don't have the time to dig through what we've learned. So we continue on to the third decision in order. This time the city's working to bring in the Big Chino water supply into the portfolio. So the city's still watching this alternative water portion. We know that the long-term storage account is growing a little bit. We know that the city is working to recharge and recover water supplies. We know that there's a direct delivery category, so this is your golf course and your industrial user. So contracts are already in place for this amount, so there's not a lot of work that gets done at that time related to this volume. This volume we're looking at very closely. There was a concern that our projections weren't matching what was actually coming in at the plants, so we worked on that block very carefully. We kept watching the long-term storage account, watching that to accrue, but this time frame is where I brought forward to the city. I said we have a significant imbalance here. We're sending way more water out than is coming back, and it was evidenced because we could see that the city entered into contracts outside of city limits, and those folks weren't necessarily required to have either be annexed. Codes had changed. There wasn't a requirement nor monies, and I think we recently learned that again with the the wastewater and recharge mayor's group that we had a year and a half ago, that the costs are high. So if you bring in, or if you offer water supplies outside of city limits into areas that aren't built to your standards, a fine example, I live in a neighborhood like that. The road is very narrow. When there will be maybe a water line upgrade, there's probably not the span of road to get the wastewater in. So I think you'll recall, you saw quite a bit of that there was a significant effort that was made by the city to look at that again. But we called that back in 2015, where we were really going to have to figure out how to close that gap, because it wasn't an issue. I think that's the thought process you need to understand, is that people can only see so far around the corners and so far down the road. And so when the city said, yes, we want to be a good neighbor, folks on the west side are running out of water, we'll go ahead and serve them water. Things happen through bills of sale, through different agreements. Water was moved into those communities, but then that's kind of where it stopped, and it kind of maintained that pattern or followed the documents of the time. In 1999, your world changed, and we needed to be working on this renewable supply pattern. And we still do. I was at a meeting yesterday where this just keeps going. So this is, as I said, I built this a long time ago just so that we could have clear communication. When you read through a DNO, it can be a little bit mind-numbing and confusing, so we just built the picture so we could have discussions. So then we bring in the 2005 to 2010 policy, another attempt at a longer-term look. But because I was seeing challenges, we started moving to a yearly policy where we kept sending supplies out, because it really was a big overhaul to try to gather all the contracts, do all the subtraction, figure out how councils had said, we're going to put this pocket of water over here and that pocket of water over there. And so I was sometimes a one-person crew, and very fortunate when I had two people that we could work through this. I see a question.
Sorry, yes, just a quick question here. And I'm just, again, 2015, I was not in high school, but I was not probably attuned to the water policy of Prescott as much as I am now.
Probably not, yeah.
So when we were doing these allocations here, I'm just trying to get to understand this, because a lot of people have, a big criticism I've heard around the idea of having a budget is that you're going to really stymie people's ability to build homes in Prescott. And I guess my question is, was that happening during this epoch? Were people coming to the city and saying, hey, gosh, I sure would like to build a home here, but I can't because of your water budget is so constrictive? Or do we have any institutional knowledge around that?
So the city was running up against how much it could, if you have a bank account and you're not getting more supplies in, you have a set amount. And
Sure.
so the city had to make decisions and set forth a budget as to how much more was it going to be able to make available for new development. However, I think it would be no different than our finance department is, the city had very carefully made pools. And so if you were starting to run up against how much you had in a certain block, maybe that was enough for that type of development. And this is where, you have to be working hand in hand with your community development.
Sure.
If they have documents that say, for a healthy community, we need roughly these ratios. We need to have, if we have this much residential going and we know they're going to have these support services, we're going to have these good paying jobs, we're going to have those recreational opportunities, we make sure we have water for new parks or whatever it might be. So yes, the city was looking at these pools very carefully, and I guess that's just part of having a bank account. If you have used it all, then you might have to make decisions. However, when we had something that was critical, we could say, oh, that's a critical piece to the water puzzle.
And I think that's a really excellent point to make, by the way, Leslie, is that it's not as if, this carries the weight of, say, code, where we can't make an exception to the water budget. It sounds like that's not what we're talking about necessarily. Just a question, and again, I just want to clarify this.
Sure.
During this time period, this water budget wasn't applicable to commercial. Am I understanding that correctly?
This, so let's see, I'm trying to refresh my memory too. I think it'll be in the next slide where we start pulling a commercial block. So yeah, I'm getting, as they say, long in the tooth. But there came a point where I was concerned and I said, you know, city, if your blocks are looking like this, available water supplies, and you know these people will eventually build, you're holding water for them, you really need to be looking at your economic driver, and that's going to be, do you have supplies to meet a commercial user that you think is, meets your needs
Right.
for your community? So whatever that might be. I don't want to call out any certain names, but there's just certain industries that you're like, yeah, that really fits in our area.
Potential commercial that would
kind of
be
commercial
beneficial, yeah.
does not fit.
Right.
And you see other communities doing that where they say in their water policy, this is a type of business that, we would not entertain
Right.
for whatever reason. And that's tough, but if you are in the Southwest and our neighbors down south as well, if you're working on supplies in a desert, then you have to make some choices as to what kind of things work in this region.
Thanks, Leslie. I appreciate the clarity there.
Chair, could I make a comment? Councilman, I think, let me put this in perspective a little bit for you, because I was on, when I first got on council, for probably about the next 3 years, we were under an allocation situation. And what I saw was people, if they ran up against the allocation, they would be the first in line for the next allocation. And so while it we were almost kind of picking winners and losers, we didn't really discourage development because, there was contracts, there was water that for lots here in the city that had already been granted. It was just when you granted that or when you gave the water. So, it was to me, it was kind of painting the city into a corner. And the reason that we did not do the allocation for a couple of years after that was because we found that it wasn't really doing anything. And we always were able to find the water if we needed the water for something that we thought was a good deal for the city. And so, I think that's why we got away from the yearly allocation or, biannual allocation because of that situation. It was very artificial when I was observing it, when we were looking at it.
Are you talking for residential?
I'm talking
and
for
commercial?
residential, yeah.
Just for residential?
Yeah.
Okay.
Commercial, well, because at the time, it was 0.35 per single-family unit, but 0.1 of that was commercial.
Right.
And what we found was, we really questioned, do we need all of that for commercial? And so, that's why we got away from the 0.35 in that way. There wasn't the commercial coming in that was supported, that would need 0.1 from every.
It wasn't warranting it.
Yeah, basically. It was a really, the system was very cumbersome as far as I was concerned.
Thank you for that information, Councilman.
Okay, we'll keep moving if that's okay. So the city had, as you can see in the green portion of the table, that's green, I guess I should say. The city continued to allocate in this fashion. There were numerous things that were coming to light, and that's, I think, why we went to a year by year for a little bit. The city would do better in having a longer term policy. It's hard for staff to adjust the tracking systems and the approaches when things are shifting every year. We did this because we were, one of the reasons that we did this was because we didn't have a decision and order back out. It was being litigated. So we held steady. We felt it was fair to keep moving water out. And this is how the councils had, at those times, had decided to do this. I think it's also important to note that I think we're seeing it again a little bit, is that when you tie up water in contracts, you keep allocating out, but nobody's building, then they're just sitting on the water. It's like gold, you know, you need that water to have your development and to get your financing. So we added more language into the policy and into contracts that said, okay, 3 years, and then, we need to see some activity. Otherwise, the water comes back in, and then somebody else can give it a try if they're ready to go. If you're not ready to go, the city, you'll see in some future slides, there were a lot of different pools to work from to cover needs. So I think that's some of the flexibility you had at one time, where we could look at how we can move things around. So we're going to keep moving. Things were looking about the same at that time. So this is, once again, something that I built because it was tricky. You needed to speak quickly and clearly to councils. And this is what council had basically asked from staff over the years. And then we had to make sure that we could prove up these blocks of water. So here again, this is the groundwater piece. We knew that was current and committed demand. So current meaning they're attached to a meter, they're using water. We know they're there. Committed means it could be a subdivision that has 10 more lots that have yet to be built. It could be committed through an IGA, something like that, that we knew we needed to keep water supplies for and see how life rolled out, basically. The pre-1998 plats, as I said, this was predominantly Prescott Lakes, but it went into Yavapai Hills and several other subdivisions, large and small. And as those things became final platted is when the city could take that in and go seek the water. So, big jump. Let's see if we can get back to where we were. Apologize. Okay, so we were very careful with this pool because we knew from statute what we had to do was there was a preliminary plat in play, and it was recognized at the state. When that preliminary plat was final platted and the council said, yes, we're ready to final plat this, then folks in the water resource management group could move that into the state and get that water to come into the portfolio. So these are things that we had to track because we weren't, when we get this increase, this wouldn't change our decision order right away. It wouldn't initiate, or we wouldn't receive a brand new DNO just because we were able to get another 50 acre feet for whatever. So we were carefully tracking that. This is your alternative block, so your renewable. Going back to the very beginning, they said, Prescott AMA, you're at a safe yield. We'd like you to use the renewable supplies. This is where the city continued to act in that fashion. They made reservations, and they had a general pool. So what you've seen so far is this budgeting was coming out of the general pool each year, so we watched that. The reservations was that we knew we had a commitment to Chino Valley Irrigation District, and we knew how much had been issued out because we had contracts for them. The vacant residential block was a block where the city council was concerned. This happened probably in the 2008 time period. It was before I was here. And they said, wait a minute, is anybody making sure that anything, any piece of land in city limits, it's going to have water, right? That's concerning. If you're in the city limits, you should get water. So the city had, the staff at the time, work through a process of determining the vacant residentially zoned lots within city limits, and a reservation was made. So we were tracking that. Your pre-existing, these are the historical agreements that my predecessor said, okay, the council wants to know what's happening on the west side of town, outside of city limits. What are those commitments? And so we had several contracts out there. Luckily, through time, I had somebody that worked with me, and we drilled through these and started running them through the legal department too, to make sure that we knew exactly what the city's requirements were to meet those obligations. And then last, deep well came into play. So, of course, deep well is transmission mains back in the 60s were moved through that area that said they would get a certain quantity. It was based on a PSI. That was negotiated just as I was arriving, where there would be 3 increments of water. They'd get first and second increments. The first increment was going to happen immediately, 450 acre feet. Another 500 was going to happen as soon as our DNO cleared the state. And then there was also a block that was put off of the Big Chino water supply. So you can see deep well hanging out over here. So back to some of the key pieces if we're on this diagram. This is why, well, let's just keep working this diagram. So everything you've seen so far, the general pool was the active piece in these green charts. But the city also had all this other activity going, so we were tracking that as well and making sure we were in step. We were watching this. This was very easy for the city. If a subdivision said, now we're going to build lot 29, and we said, great, you're in our groundwater portion. Go, you're good. There was not even a blink. We knew we had them covered. If we had other things happening in here, we knew that we needed to work with the applicant carefully with the pre-1998 plats, make sure that we were getting what was called substantial conformance, and run that through the process. I think we can probably leave this block aside. We will see this again a little bit later. But this is when Big Chino came in and the city councils were making reservations and working through that. So we might bounce back. So key information. So city identifies all council actions over the years with their supplies and has account balances for all. So I just went through that piece. The general pool balance at that time was 479 acre feet was set aside. Bullwhacker came in from a very old agreement related to Yavapai Hills. The transmission main went through their ranch to get to Yavapai Hills. There were some obligations there that hadn't been satisfied, so we were real careful with that. And Embry-Riddle, we knew that at the time, one of the very strong and key long-term economic drivers in the area was Embry-Riddle, and Embry-Riddle had room to grow. And we wanted to make sure we had water supplies for their growth. Daytona campus was built out. So we were looking at a balance about 324 acre feet. Water was allocated in 2016 as 125 acre feet to market, 100 acre feet to workforce, and we looked at multifamily duplex apartments. I'm going to stop right there. We knew, once again, we just didn't have in town that kind of development. We knew that we had capability here to do that, and we wanted to keep that pool available. And as you can see from recently, there's been a huge surge in getting that kind of development going. You can just kind of look around town and see how that's happened. So I guess this is one of the key points is things don't always happen in the time frame you want them to happen. So and last, 99 acre feet for commercial. That was put aside because we could see if we had a surge in growth. You have to think of the times again and know what people had to deal with. If we were in an economic downturn, we weren't going to be in a downturn forever. And so we were trying to lay the groundwork through policies, through water resource management, to be able to catch that surge when we came out of it. And we wanted to make sure our commercial, we had at least this available, readily available.
Leslie, let me interrupt and go back to the workforce water allocation.
Yes, ma'am.
Did any water ever get allocated to any workforce housing? Because I can't think of any workforce housing in this community.
It was a very strange definition, and George Worley, if he's still in the audience, yes. We talked a lot about how do we handle that terminology. So that terminology came in. I would say fairly few. However, when we look at how things stand in the water resource management model now, by land, it's land keyed, it's keyed to the land. There's quite a bit of duplexes and smaller things that kind of came along. I wish I could give you an exact answer. I don't know what the actual volume was, but we can pull it from records.
So we already good-heartedly, we're going to support workforce housing, allocated the water, but the second part of the puzzle never happened.
Potentially, and I think maybe one of your best examples would be Granite Dells Estates. So that has, if you read the contracts from the get-go, the city was building the supplies in for that master plan, and part of the build-in was workforce housing.
Yes,
so you just
I saw
kind
it
of
on
need to
their
step back to
master
that.
plan, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Excuse me, Chair. One thing. I asked a question a few years back when we were discussing workforce housing. And I said, does that mean that if you're retired, you can't move into workforce housing? And the answer was no. If you are retired, yes, you can move into these housing areas, which really kind of neutered that whole situation because, okay, if you were pricing workforce housing and giving it water and you couldn't, limit it to people in the workforce, then it was somewhat of a moot point.
Yeah, self-defeating. Okay, thank you.
A lot of lessons learned over time. So the best laid plans sometimes don't happen the way you would like them to happen. Prescott land is always going to be more expensive. It's just the way it is. I had somebody present that to me quite a while ago and said, it's going to be hard to do workforce housing in Prescott. It's just a high dollar area. So, but the council's made every effort because they felt that was important at the time. Going back to reservations, so we're looking at this block. I just pulled the numbers that we had in acre feet, what was still set aside for CVID, what was for vacant residential within city limits. So we had a lot of activity and we just knew which block to go to as soon as that customer came in. If they didn't meet any of those blocks, then we'd move over to the general pool and see if we could allocate from there. So you had a lot of opportunities with that. And let's see, and Deep Well Ranch. So I put in a little blip there. The allocation stayed at this point. It included at the support services factor again, and CVID was still at 0.25, because if you're working based on an accounting system, and I bring this up now, we have this bifurcated thing happening where, okay, we're going to say units or we're going to say volume, and then sometimes they go together and sometimes they don't. And so that either you need to do it all by units or you need to know how you're going to track what you're doing. It has to be one way or the other. So with all this happening, to me, I thought, wow, this is antiquated. We have modern tools that we could try to employ. So in the 2015 time period, after working through this and figuring out how the city had gotten to the point it had gotten to and all these blocks that it had created, and not saying it was bad, it was just what the city had done that seemed to make sense with the conditions they had. Here's the policy that I had helped write at that time. But really, I pushed the city and said, we need to develop a long-term water management model. We can't do this stagnant. We had some great spreadsheets, but life doesn't always go the direction of the spreadsheet. It might do other things. So this is where, thankfully, the council was in agreement that we needed to invest some monies into a long-term water management model. Here again, your staff was one, maybe two at the time, and we did as much work as we could. It was a long process to get these things going. But more importantly was the GIS interface. I thought we can't do this anymore because everybody gets different pictures in their mind, but if we have mapping that's keyed to the ground, keyed to where the accounts are, keyed to where the subdivisions are going to potentially be, they align with contract, we just have a much cleaner, quicker conversation. So moving ahead. So Councilman Montoya, this goes back to your question. This was summarized. I just took a clip from one of our old tracking sheets. Each year, we knew exactly what was going into contract, which pool it would be coming out of. Here's the CVID. Here's the historic. Here's the vacant residential. We were watching Deep Well as they were coming along. At some point, it was a shared conversation where the value of a master plan for that area would be really helpful and for both the Deep Well folks as well as the city to know how that was all going to play out. So this pretty much stopped in 2019. These numbers, you start seeing things go negative, and that's not a true negative. It's we had to stop. Basically, the city was already moving in 2018 to allocating water in a different manner. In 2019, they adopted the policy, And that's where things stand. So the key information is this is a summary of allocations and reservations until about 2019, in the timeframe where changes were being made, and a new water policy in 2019 was adopted. So it looks pretty much like accounting practices. I just didn't give you all the sheets by year that said, okay, these are the contracts for 1999. These are the contracts. And then these rolled into what we have here at the city called map view. We were updating the layers all the time, and I don't know if we'll get to that today, but I can see there's a question.
Chair, if I may.
Go ahead.
So I'm just looking at this, and this was one of my questions. So it looks like in 2016, there was 45.08 outstanding for vacant residential within city limits. And then the next year was 3.90. Was that a factor of the changing of the policy, or did that infill happen during that time period? And I guess my larger question that I'm driving at, when I look at CVID and...
You need this one? Yeah.
CVID and vacant, and so these zeroed out numbers, does that mean that we've exhausted those resources? Do they still exist? Or, and I guess when I say resources, I mean the set-asides that we established for those.
I think I'll be able to address that in the next few slides.
Okay. Then I will wait
There's gonna
patiently.
be-
Way ahead of
The
us.
short answer is going to be generally no. Everything was squished together into
Okay.
one water. So back up to vacant residential. So what we could see happening, so staff had this laid out. Vacant residential wasn't moving, and we had a significant volume of water there. And so we were infusing water. It was council approved. We were infusing water into the general pool, and then we were going to offset that off of Big Chino water supplies. Was the plan. And so that's why you see those numbers start to change. So we were infusing, be careful with this mouse. So vacant residential was dropping as we were infusing that into the general pool. So yeah,
I think in accounting that's called robbing Peter to pay Paul.
so we were offsetting. I think we need to be
I'm
careful
just
about
kidding.
that.
I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
Because we were making sure those homeowners or those landowners were going to be whole. You have to remember at this time the city was going full bore at having Big Chino here in 2009, and then we had economic downturn. So what we could do if was the accounting structure was we knew that we could keep these folks whole because they were coming in so slowly. One of the best examples is the old movie theater up on Senator Highway. That's a vacant residentially zoned area. It doesn't really matter anymore because the city's taken a new approach and we're just about to get there, the shift that they made. But that still sits vacant. So if
someone could come along and develop it and need water.
somebody would come along, yeah. And so they knew that if that one person came in, well, then we would have still supplies in the vacant residential here. General pool might be able to work with them. We didn't limit people. We generally didn't let people from this area, if we were using this water, we wouldn't dip into anybody's reservations. That's just wrong. That's like subletting or,
Yeah.
that doesn't seem to make sense. So let's keep moving because I know we're running on time. We're trying to get to, so you know where you've been, so you can make choices. You have ultimately a policy in front of you that says you're going to potentially allocate something biannually, this amount and this amount in two different pools, if that's the direction that you want to go. So of course, this is also tracking the Big Chino. And so we knew that there, in the decision order, a certain volume was approved. The council had chosen not to budget anything. However, we wanted to make sure that it was clear that we had an IGA with the town of Prescott Valley for a certain quantity of the water. Sometimes people look at water and go, wow, we got more water than we know what to do with. Look at that, 8,000, what could we do with that? But if they don't realize they have commitments, that can be a problem. So, this was subtracted off. There was a reservation based on their pre-annexation development agreement that their third volume of water of 900 acre feet would be part of the Big Chino. So we watched that carefully. And this is where vacant residential, we started to move that over. to Big Chino because we just weren't having, we could see it year after year as people were coming in for water. Nobody was generally using the vacant residential. An example of vacant residential is where Touchmark is now. There was a slice of land up there that was related to vacant residential. And I, when that one came in, I'm like, wow, we're actually going to exercise our policy for how vacant residential comes to be. So they ended up needing more water than what was in the reservation. And of course, the city worked with them. They had some ability to work through that. So this is a remaining volume. Here again, this is just so you can see where you've been and how you tried to handle these things over time. So let's look at the present. So now the city combined the groundwater and the altwater volume. So instead of working mostly off of this pool and watching things come into play potentially related to the Big Chino, the decision was to put these two pools together. So I think it's pretty clear that's a shift from where the city had been before, right? So if you're saying only using renewable supplies was the way you wanted to go, when you did this, that changes your whole structure, basically. So this is, the city adopted a new water policy. Just pulled the resolution in case somebody wanted to look at that. So the supply side that was presented to the council, the 16,507, that's these two added together. And then they were saying that the use right now, this is 6,700, was how much was being pumped now. So City of Prescott presentation to the council, slide 7, when I go back, I can see that this was 2018 pumping. So we've advanced again, where I think the council now understands. At the time, I don't think the council understood. This would be just current demand, not your commitments that were out there and potentially your projected demand. So this looked like a very large number. Look at all the water we have. So we'll run down the key information. The city determines that it has 9,807 acre feet, so that's a subtraction here, available for budgeting. Checking the records, at the 6,700, here's the source. I checked back at the ADWR records from 2018, so it's rounded. It was a little bit more than that, but another 30 acre feet is not going to make a big difference there. No set volumes were made available for each year with this policy. Any request for water within city limits under 2 acre feet was administratively moved forward. Any water request within city limits more than 2 acre feet needed to contact the community development department for instructions on how to proceed. Any water requests outside of city limits, contact the water resources staff. This was typically the permit counter, but they'd kick questions out to me about different contracts if there was a question. They're running pretty much solo, I think, now. If a contract exists, the applicant follows within city limits policy, so it bumps them back into the fold there. One of the statements from the policy said, water will be provided, but no specific amount of water will be allocated to any project through separate contract. So that was in the policy. So here's where you have a pretty significant shift, right? So if you do the subtraction, as discussed here, that looks like a whole lot of water that you have available for allocation. But as I said, it lacked the committed and the projected. Okay, so Gwen Rowich, who's available, if you have some questions, and Katie Hine have recently been trying to kind of backfill the tool that's used called Central Square. It's a customer contact point. So if they come in for water, what's happening? And they're looking at this because the question within the current policy is, well, we would like in the future staff to tell us how much is administrative and how much is water service agreements. So we don't have the full picture here, but what's available at this time is they were able to determine in 2020 how much acre feet per year was administratively approved. And then how much in 2021. This is the total. Then water service agreements. This gets a little slippery because we've had water service agreements and then they started being called water service applications. So that's getting a little muddy in the history here. But some of these have contracts, I guess some of them don't. We can pull those in
That was going to
time.
be my question, because I think it's a little muddy to say that the council approved 136 acre feet per year, because some of those were, if they're contracts, weren't they in essence already approved? I mean, I know that's a little bit part of the muddy process of how our water service application process works right now, but it would seem to me that it's not exactly as if those are, if someone already has a contract for water, it's not as if they're, I mean,
Allocating new, you're just,
Yeah,
it's kind of a reaffirming.
yeah, I guess
maybe?
in my mind, that,
Unless there was a
and this is a question I brought up again and again as we've talked about this policy, and I think this is getting lost by a lot of people, in my opinion, is that when we talk about a water budget, we're not talking about a water budget for already approved contracts, right? I mean, that's, because we can't budget that, right? It's like trying to go back and spend a dollar you've already spent, to kind of continue the metaphor of the accounting system.
Yeah, I think you're running into some challenges, and I think we're, staff are working as best we can. Gwen's writing policy from 2018, trying to weave in the expectations. Staff is trying to catch up data systems to figure out how you can do this, so.
I have one question that I want to, that is kind of something, and as we've moved through the slides, this has been something that is a curiosity of mine, and I don't know if it may be too broad of a question to answer in this forum.
Right.
So if you want to hold off, you can. But when we look at this allocation and the budget that we're talking about, and this is where it kind of got muddy for me, is at some point we were holding out water from Big Chino pipeline. Am I understanding that correct?
We generally kept it separate.
Yeah, but I mean, I saw that we kept it separate, but then there was development that got approved along those lines.
I would say no.
No? Okay.
About the transfer.
So,
Yeah, because there's Deep Well on there and Prescott Valley. The IGA, is that just reflective of the agreement we have on Big Chino?
yes.
Okay, and then the
No,
Deep
no
Well,
water's moving because no water's.
right, and I guess that, I just want to
decision of the
clarify.
Council, yeah.
So there's no, even though in theory that water exists, there's no way to deliver it. So we're not actually approving any development around that water that has no way to actually get to end users. Is that correct?
At this point, except for, I would say, Deep Well, when that was moved by council into this area, basically, it was a block of 900 that was.
Right,
slated
and
for-
that was my thought.
It was reserved for them. Nobody else, we couldn't sublet that out,
Right.
that wasn't okay. But recently, as you know, that was moved in for current use,
Right.
ready for them when they're ready to move.
So where are they going to get the water?
From the existing system.
Even though the idea is that it's pledged
Chino.
off the Big Chino?
Well, this was a decision, here
It was
again,
transferred.
it was transferred over.
November of
So if
23.
No, I mean, and again, I'm not trying to, like, to me, the concern I have, and again, I'm not an accountant, but I do run a business that is financial focused, and I don't understand how you can, to me, that's like writing a hot check.
Well, I think we have to be careful here. If the city took the stance that they felt they had 9,807 acre feet available based on the subtraction that was done,
Sure.
based on putting pools together, and there were other elements that came along the way, then they, as a council, you determined that there's enough supply to make that 900 available now.
I mean, in the grand scheme of things, I follow what you're saying, like that it existed, so to speak, but it's, again, and I'm just saying from my perspective, I'm kind of like, well, it just doesn't, it's a little bit of an intellectual leap for me personally, but maybe I don't have the, accounting expertise to really get it.
Thank you for bringing that up. The original development agreement for Deep Well Ranch had put that 900 acre feet water kind of in reserve for future growth as Deep Well progressed. And that decision went from executive session to a voting session, no study session, and it was done in a heartbeat, and it raised a lot of questions.
Chair, could I ask a question? Leslie, is all of the water for Deep Well in our current water resource management model?
That's where we're getting to.
Can you answer yes or no, or?
Well, I would say what had happened was we had 1,850 acre feet overall,
Yes.
spread into 3 tiers, first increment, second increment, third increment. They've all been pushed over for readily use, to use. But the caveat, I think, is that I believe, and I can pull the contract here and look at it, is that ultimately Deep Well can build up to 10,500 homes based on what council approved. Okay, so now you're having that kind of back and
Units
forth is
versus volume of water.
volume. So the best our consultant could do, and we were asked this, do we try to load the 10,500 into the landmass? And he goes, it doesn't fit. But we did it anyways. So to answer your question, we tried to do the best we could with this water resource management model.
Sure.
And load in 10,500, but we know,
Well, I think that's only
reasonable.
reasonable. I mean, if we really do want to know where we stand with our water, we needed to load it all into the resource management model so that we could see where we stood from the standpoint of what the difference with all of our all of our committed water versus our top there at 16,500 acre feet.
Right, so if you made a commitment in a contract, then you have to honor the contract. And so that's why we moved 10,500 into the water resource management model, even though it doesn't fit on the landmass. There's going to be streets cut away and there's going to be commercial nodes and things like that. So they've built a very nice master plan. I think everybody just got moving really fast in working through some elements there. So I guess, that kind of harkens back a little bit to, do we use 0.35 or 0.17? So did you?
Yeah, that was going to be my question.
load up
With
more
those
than you
units, are we
needed
doing
into the model?
0.17 or 0.35 when you loaded into the worm?
It didn't, because I was told that we needed to load the unit count. So as I said, you're kind of dancing between, are you going to do an accounting system and how is that going to work? Or are you going to say you're going to allocate through units only? And there are some reasons why you have to look at units. The Prescott Lakes contract was built that way through the state when you get groundwater allowance. So here again, I think this is why water resources can get really challenging, and as staff over time, before I was even here, and that's why we went so carefully back through this to try to make clear diagrams, know the accounting, where did it go, ran down as many contracts as we could. And basically, I think I was told at some point, when the deep well had come in, and they were trying to settle out, well, a PSI to like how much water does that really mean? They worked through that. The council was looking at staff going, we don't want to find any more surprises out there. So we did a grand effort, I think, a really hard effort to try to go through everything and figure out what that would be. So we might be digressing. We get back to Member Shishka's point. We're doing the best we can to load everything into the DNO model, the worm. And it's important to know we have a version of DNO. That's how we had to build it. We had to fine tune it to get it to the state. And then we're going to get a portfolio response back out at some point.
Leslie, going back, I'm learning many acronyms, but could you refresh my memory on PSI?
Oh, pounds per square inch. It was just,
Oh,
sorry,
okay.
I didn't mean to, yeah. So you have
Back when
contracts.
that's how they cared about the water.
Well, I knew that one.
So Deep Well was a ranch property, right? And so they wanted at least 4 turnouts, I think is how it was. They wanted 4 locations on the ranch, and they made the units through pounds per square inch at that location. at this
Really?
location, at this
Okay,
location.
not
And so-
GPMs, gallons per minute.
No.
I've never heard of that being used for other than a tire. Okay, thank you.
Can I-
check with Craig? Do I have that right? Can we do pounds per square inch of water at, I think, I need to pull the contract.
I just need to interrupt briefly. We're getting messages that I guess we've improved our microphone sound, so talking really close to the microphone is
Not
muffled.
necessary?
No, not necessary. If you could back up just a little bit.
Thank you.
That's
E2?
an unusual challenge.
Yeah.
Matt, can you
Someone
please
turn-
speak up? So,
Craig
and
probably
yes.
has the history on this one. He
On
remembers
that
what on the ranch.
original easement and the agreement went with that, All it did was identify the connections and said that it would allow this many PSI, which is, it was not in a means that anyone would be able to put a number or something to that. So then there was subsequent updates to that in order to bring it into the quantity, and that's where the 1,800 acre feet now came from. So now there are the two items. There's, the master plan has the 10,500 rooftops that can be built with the 1,800 acre feet that were in the pre-annexation, developmental pre-annexation agreement. So there are those two. So as time goes on, rooftops will be continued to count it just like the first item. 783 rooftops have been approved in that land area to date. And then today we are estimating the 0.17 acre feet per rooftop, but long-term, the worm will represent true water used. So there's a potential that 40 or 50 years from now, that they're at 10,000 rooftops, but maybe the water has come up to the 1,800 acre feet. So there are two limitations, there are three limitations that go with the water for Deepwell Ranch. The rooftops, the acre feet, and the maps that include the land that are associated with that. So long-term, all of that has to be tracked, and then that's what will subsequently identify how many rooftops and how much water will be used out there.
And Craig, excuse me, ma'am. I just wanted to ask Craig a question, if you, thank you.
Go ahead.
I didn't want to interrupt you or.
I'll take second
Craig,
place.
We're at 0.17 right now,
Correct.
but I just look at my own water usage. You know, I'm a, husband, wife in a single family tract, 1/5 of an acre, things like that. And it's probably closer to 0.10. As time goes on and as we average current use into what we've looked at as past use, could that number get closer to my 0.10 than even the 0.17?
Absolutely, because we have enough. So the 0.17 is the city average. Take all the residential water usage into play there. So if you only use 0.1 and then someone else is using 0.25, then that's where it's coming into the balance. As we go over time and more of the old homes in the community are updated to the modern standards and modern high efficiency water use on faucets, showers, toilets, everything, then it will continue to reduce those. Also through water conservation, we're constantly working on removing turf. So every time we have a conservation measure that someone gets a rebate from and does, then that will help reduce that as well. So yes, there's a potential that our residential average can drop even below that 0.17.
Okay, thank you. Let me get back to Deepwell Ranch. Can Deepwell Ranch transfer that water to undeveloped land, adjacent land, sell it if he doesn't have enough land, but he has more water than land, as I understand?
I wasn't in on the drafting of that, so I think that becomes a legal question. I haven't read anything that says that if you were allocated at a higher volume or if you didn't use everything that you carry it, that becomes a legal question, I think, how the city wants to handle that. Maybe that's not for today. Maybe it's a question that can be investigated a little bit more. If there's that thing, I've not seen anything in the time I've been here, contracts that said, what we used to do is say if you didn't build to a certain number of units, then we're going to pull that water back in. That was clear language in earlier contracts. So if you were going to build a 6-plex and something happened and you can only do a 4-plex, that too would have been returned to the city's portfolio. I don't think there's language like that in some of these contracts.
Yeah.
We'll look into it, but I'm unaware of that as being a requirement in the contracts, but I can't answer off the top of my
Yeah,
head.
I mean, if Deepwell's been allocated that water, I can't see him returning it. Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right, let's see where we're at here. Okay, so we're going through this, and this is tracking the city's trying to use now. So we had former tracking that kind of looked like this, where we were running off of contracts, keeping track of everything, and then now we have, this is being worked on a little bit. So we know if a building permit went through and it was administratively approved, it's looking, these are the numbers that are coming out of the system at this time. If it was had a water service agreement identification on it, here we might, I think this is what Member Montoya was asking, do we have a mixed bag by any chance here? And then what volumes that aren't included up here, and I think that's probably pretty obvious, is the larger contracts like AED and Transfer of Deep Well and Stringfield weren't necessarily being tracked in this manner. They're held separately. So the bottom line is when the city went to this new policy, you can see that there wasn't a budget volume, like what is, is the 9,800 what you're subtracting from? Or is it something else? And then as things were happening in those past 3 years, what does that volume look like? And so there's, as you see, you have part of the equation, basically. You have what was administratively approved, water service agreements, but how do you know what's left that you can allocate? So that's a little unclear. So let's move into, yikes, we gotta move faster. So these things don't get resolved in one meeting. So your future, you have a 2022 draft policy that's being worked on. The thought process, as I said, it bounced back to a 2018 policy. Gwen's working really hard to write in the elements. As you can see, some things have been lost through time now. There's probably no stepping back to certain things. But this 22 policy is saying, okay, we still want to work with these two blocks, not just this block. So if you do that, you still have your 16,507. You are saying that you're going to subtract your 2001 decision order modification. It's unapproved at this time. We're about 60 days in, just in case you wanted to know, at the state. We still have to get to that 150 days for administrative approval, and then we have another block of time that we'll be going through as well. But this is being used as your demand estimate. So you can come at, what are you subtracting from, right? So this is the 16,500. You're saying your current, committed, and projected, which is, this is very different from what you saw just a few slides ago. So you're looking at maybe 1,978 acre feet for budgeting. And the idea, of course, is that you have to know who your current demand is. You know those by billing. You have billing points. Your committed can be a bunch of different things at this point. It could be your commitments in existing subdivisions that date back to 1998 or further back. It could be IGAs that you've entered into recently or in the past. And your projected is areas where you have contracts out there, but they're not platted yet. So luckily our consultant is working with us as closely as he can to work through this. So we're still looking at these two pieces. So note that policy 21 states currently, savings accrued to the effective date hereof accumulated from the difference between the overall volume of water allocated and the actual volume consumed by the project. So this kind of goes back to your, well, here again, it's hard to say, 0.35 minus 0.17, or is it 0.17 minus what they've used in the past few years? What's that? What number are you really trying to get at? And so if it says that you're going to, let's see, consumed by projects that were put into contract shall be retained in the WORM as committed demand and not used to support additional development. So I guess what I'm trying to advise is be very careful what language you put in a policy if you can actually crank it out the other side and show that you're putting it back into whatever element of this process that you have in place. This will not be achievable if a pool is used completely for new growth and not just for meeting the current and committed from the 1998 and pre-1998 plats. So let's see if we can break this down a little bit more. If you're allocating the difference between 0.35 as to how this pool was built from the state and 0.17, you have that volume. But if you've already shuttled that off in the past few years into contracts, you can see where the confusion might come in as to how that may or may not work. So let's get into the worm. So this is the product that had been being worked on. The use of it, I think, generally in that 2018, 2019 timeframe where you adopted a new policy, was just getting at this 0.17. So in-house, using back of the napkins, I knew pretty early that we had an average of 0.17. It was nice that the worm confirmed that. Then it was a question of, okay, so that has worked in the city's favor, because if we have aquifer or water level declines, or we're having challenges with other communities getting a physical availability determination out of the state, we have a pretty reasonable cushion. So that's when additional planning would generally come in. So the worm was built. It wasn't exercised as it needed to be until we did the DNO application. That's where we started to really understand a lot more, and that's what you're relying on up here, is this work that was done for the DNO, because otherwise you might be still thinking that you would do this kind of subtraction versus making sure you added in your commitments and your projected demand that you have in contract.
Leslie, I have a question. Could you go back to the map that you just put up?
Yep.
Thank you. Now, it's the city limits only. Are you telling me that the worm only calculates water in the city limits and not in our water service area, which is much larger?
No, it doesn't. So this,
Oh, you're kidding.
no, so it doesn't just calculate city limits. So let's go through a couple more slides. So
Oh,
you can
it
see
does
how
include, oh, okay.
there's more. There's more. So here's what's important, I think, is that we built the water resource management model was built to look into the future, a long-term water management tool. You need to know your different components. What's in city limits? What's in your water service area? What's your general plan area? So we were building out to the general plan area. There was also discussions, as you probably recall at council, an expansion area. So we were trying to figure out how that was going to be handled. The bottom line, if we keep moving here, it covers your water service area.
Thank you.
So the red points are your current demand, the green points are your committed, and the purple is your projected. So I think that probably makes sense. You know, this is your deep well area. So as things are platted, we're working really hard to make sure that we can get that into what I should call, I'm sorry this is confusing, because I think there is confusion. The worm was built looking at the general plan area, which is bigger. Let's go to the next slide. So we were building out into this area, but we also knew our water service area extended up into Chino Valley.
Leslie,
But, yeah,
didn't we approve recently the IGA that allows the worm to be used in Chino Valley, like for that area up there? Or to share that resource anyways?
yes. So, yeah, I guess that was the asset sharing agreement.
Yeah.
We don't have any active,
So it's
activity.
not in place yet.
we haven't brought in there. Well, here again, we got to be careful. We're going to have to bring it into this overall look, but we also need to know actively at the state we have a DNO version, which was trying to get at. So let me back up. The state is going to say, we can't just say, you know what, we want water for all this, and we're just going to, sit on it. We want you to allocate that water. They're not going to do that. They want you to show what is what's committed, what's been reasonably projected. We can't lock up supplies. The state won't allow for that. So I think that's why I'm being careful. If there is adding in of the Chino Valley data for their water system, then we need to be very careful which version of this worm we're talking about so that we have clear discussions and there's not confusion. And so today is just that let's get started discussion so you understand the worm a little bit, because you haven't seen it visually very much, I don't think. So just for clarity, for this policy, it will probably be important to decide if you are going to follow the worm DNO version and keep, if you think that your population is generally going to use 0.17 and we have a document coming back out of the state at some point, you probably want to keep that intact versus getting lost in, okay, well, did we throw in supplies here and did we throw in supplies here? At this point, we didn't. What you're seeing is what is in the DNO, which goes back to this number here. I hope this makes sense. We don't want to be mixing numbers here and get confused. Okay, so city limits. The points. These are what we have in the DNO version. I think to Chairperson Rusing's point, we have activity in city limits, we have activity outside of city limits, and also activity in a neighboring community. And this goes way back. So the red pieces again are current. This could have been, this is probably Chino Meadows right up here. That was based on an agreement well before the Chino Valley Irrigation District agreement, that water was going to be served to that subdivision. Parkside is another good example. That was in play before the IGA for the surface water supplies that the city has now, that trade-off. So we need to keep moving. So red boundary, you know, this is where you think you might grow to. So where are these supplies going to be used? And so let's look at that quickly. We're thinking that, you know, you're looking at 1,900, maybe we'll just say 2,000 to make it easy for discussion's sake. So what needs to be considered into the future? Areas within the general plan but not yet identified in the WORM for supplies. So that's where these pieces come in. Is the city planning in their general plan? And I think you're probably in fairly good shape when you enter your general plan exercises here pretty soon in the summer. I think you'll have the support from a WORM that's going to look at the bigger picture for you. But if we look at this and say, okay, so recently with deep well and AED, that was about 1,600 acre feet. Is that the same volumes you're going to need out here? So do you hold that supply for that area? You look at it a little bit more. This is what planners do in water. Areas within the city that don't have water supplies assigned to them yet in the WORM. So examples here is this area. Part of this is Pioneer Park, but you might want to expand it. You have some residential opportunities here. You have another piece over here. You know, I apologize. I usually do a you are here kind of thing. Let's do that. On this map, this is the Yavapai Prescott Indian Tribe kind of polygon right here. You're sitting down at City Hall down here. This is airstrip. So we know we're not going to be putting water on airstrip.
Leslie, let me interrupt. You know, we have Glassford Hill in that area, which is slated for a potential regional park. And has anyone thought of maybe, since it'll be open space and there won't be any homes, of looking at how much water that would potentially save us by not having homes built in that area?
We could, I guess, if it remains a natural park, that would be different than if you need parks that have turf for play and things
Yeah,
like that as
just
your
a
community grows.
Natural park, yeah.
We can look at that and see how that might play. So I guess the question again of this roughly 2,000 that you're looking at potentially, would it be used out in these areas? Would it be used as part of your areas that aren't assigned yet? Here's another, probably for landmark's sake, this is Grant Dell's Estates, and they'll probably be looking for additional supplies to serve that area.
So Leslie, just to confirm,
Yes.
every colored dot on there is in the WORM.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
These are good questions. You need to get to know your tools into the future. You know, we made this lift that we couldn't use spreadsheets all the time, and we're going to need to use spreadsheets with visuals so that you can know exactly what you're talking about at council meetings, exactly what you're talking about at subcommittee meetings.
Leslie, when you referenced Granite Dells Estates just now,
Yeah, yes.
are they Are they already allocated that water through their development agreement, or no? Is that?
They've had some amendments, so they moved their water volume over to the west, and this piece of land here is in city limits, so I would assume the city would want to serve that at some point.
Right. Okay, thank you.
I mean, I don't know what the planning is for that. Okay, let's keep moving. So what about areas within the city that are upsizing or infilling to meet added community needs? So once again, a planning tool that you use. The Whispering Rock area, I'm just trying to pull more recent things so they're familiar to you. So Whispering Rock, when it came in quite a few years ago, at this point, meaning 4, maybe, time moves, they were looking at kind of a commercial and more of a private practice, smaller medical offices, things like that. Ultimately, now they have 60 acre feet in contract with the potential for the main piece to be hospital services. So as you can imagine, as your community grows, you need more services, and you need to be able to plan and not be at the point where we're like, wow, we allocated everything to maybe more residential when you really wanted to keep supplies available for potentially the upsizing. And these can come in so many different ways. You know, this is YRMC West. That's fairly recent. You've seen the new Dignity building. The Hilton Garden is an example of you need more tourism places, bedding. So that's an example there. The tribe has the ability to grow. Once again, this is their block here. We've seen such a shift in how economics and box stores work or don't work, so there's some opportunity there. Here again, not picking on anybody by any means. When you have more people and more cars, you probably want to get them washed, so that's one of those support services that you might want to have, you know, into areas up here potentially, so people aren't driving all the way down to get to a car wash. Criminal Justice Center is another example of things that can upsize in your community or infill that can happen along the way. Are we planning well for those things? Okay, areas within the city that are served by private water companies or where water is hauled. So always a question mark. So if we have a water company, we've seen many communities do that. They assume a private water company. That comes with so many challenges, but I know in my time here, we've had calls where, you know, we're kind of tired of our wells aren't doing so great. We're not, you know, Corporation Commission is how we're regulated. Would the city be able to serve? So if you have private water companies within your boundaries or adjacent to them, you know, is there any planning for that? We've seen that if there is an incident of some sort, doesn't matter what it is, low production, arsenic, conflict with wastewater or septic tanks, the city has stepped up and started providing water, but you can only do so much.
So I think you just answered my question, but you're saying the contingency of perhaps that these water suppliers couldn't continue to meet the demand that they've set up for.
Right.
Is what you're talking about from a
Infrastructure-
planning perspective.
Right, is the city thinking into the future? Are these systems, Cottonwood would be a great example. Clarkdale did the same thing where they started acquiring those smaller water companies and building them into you know, they were already within their city limits, or they were adjacent to, or they were in their general plan area. If there's instability, then you generally see the water provider figure out what they might be able to do. I'm not saying there is, I'm just saying that we know there's challenges that can come up. Okay, so looking ahead again, so areas within the city's service area, so this is to Chairperson Rusing's point again, so you know, what are we covering and how do we know what we're covering? These are a side-by-side. This comes out of our map view program, and this is coming out of the worm. But how is the city looking at, let's get some points of reference here. So this is the highway coming through here. This is the main commercial corridor as well. So the map view project is showing that this peachy color is a portion of the town of Chino Valley's limits. It extends off, you know, this direction and up, basically, up into here. The Peak Hatching is a recent IGA for their commercial corridor, and so they provided a map. City GIS, converted that into a layer, and we were able to add that and see what lands that might cover. And these little blue squares, or they almost look like circles, these are well points from the Department of Water Resources. And I think the last piece is all these various colors in here. If it has a color, the city has an obligation through the Chino Valley Irrigation District, IGA, to serve. So how is our contracts matching up with our WORM DNO version? And so the red points are current demand again. Green points are committed, so our consultant made sure we were putting in points for everything that's CVID IGA. And the bright blue points are the corridor. So with any tool that you're using, you're cross-checking, and so we can see we potentially have a cross-check need. This is, you would expect more blue points. Let's just put it that way at this point. So if we pull these points and we say, okay, they're going to get an acre foot per parcel, or however that IGA is written for the commercial corridor, then that could be about 65 acre feet. Our concern from a staff level is if they have commitment through the CVID IGA, say they're one of these owners here, and they have potentially, we have a commitment through the commercial corridor, do they get one or both? Those are things that need to be considered. So that, I think, the reasoning behind this discussion, this point of the PowerPoint, is what do you know? And what are you watching out for? And if you are saying into the public, or we're talking as a group, figuring these things out, are we seeing the same picture? Do we understand it the same way? As to member Shishka's point, is it all in there? And you want to have a comfort level. Is it all in there or not? If it's not, then, we have more work to do, either understanding our contracts that have been written and making sure they're translating properly. Okay, we're getting close to the end here. What future needs again? So wells outside of city limits. I'm sorry, I got a big jump on that again. So this is our older map view. This isn't the WORM. And what we wanted to look at was, okay, what are these areas that have large exempt wells? There's quite a bit of discussion about exempt wells. The city has said they don't want exempt wells. But would you be serving these areas in the future or not? If you're looking, here's the CVID, the Chino Valley area again, with the city or the town limits up here. Then the commercial corridor hatched in pink again. You can see, it's like they're surrounded. There's lots of wells in here. Is the city going to be looking to serve that, this area here, serving into this area here? History's shown that you've done it in the past. So when this is Highland Pines, when their wells were struggling, a water line was set out. More recently, you have folks down in this area. This is the Hard Rock area. You're up in the Bradshaws. If the wells aren't keeping up, there's some folks that would like to be annexed in here. I think the pocket for Cactus Mobile Home Park is, let's see if we can get located here. Here's the polygon for the tribe. So they're kind of hanging out right about here. So we just bring these things up as water professionals of how are you looking to spend this 2,000 or so?
Leslie, can you identify a couple of the more populated well areas there, like that one that's kind of south of the Chino area, and then the one that's to the east?
It's here?
No, further down where you were just a second
Oh,
ago.
here. Oh, okay. Yeah. and
Just so I have some orientation.
Yeah, I apologize. That's, the UR here is critical, and I've probably looked at this too many times that now I know. So this is your Williamson Valley corridor. Another layer probably would be helpful to have the AMA boundary on here, but this is the Williamson Valley corridor here.
And then to the east there, that big pocket to the east.
This is going to be your neighbors' basically dry lot subdivisions or lot splits that have occurred without potentially, assured water supply. They're working off of wells. So they're outside of Prescott Valley
Okay.
typically.
Leslie, let me draw our
The
attention.
group back here says Paquito, call it Paquito.
Keto Valley, thank
Paquito,
you.
Near Mingus Mountain.
Let me draw your attention back to this area on our southwest border with the National Forest and the Bradshaws. If we're going to prioritize giving water, annexing, we need to prioritize this area, because if we have a forest fire, odds are it's going to come from the southwest. And that's why the Mullen Way project is so important that it proceeds, because this area has no fire hydrants. The last fire hydrant is along, all the fire hydrants stop along Copper Basin Road. So everything south of Copper Basin Road and the National Forest has no fire hydrants. There's on wells, they're hauling water. These homes have sprinkler systems, and there's no way they could sprinkle their home if their home catches on fire, or if lightning strikes a tree on a windy day. I mean, it's a very dangerous situation, and we need to be aware of it. And that's one reason why we need to prioritize this area, and especially the Mullen Way project, and at least get some city fire hydrants out there, because that's our first line of defense for the community, is this area here. Thank you.
I think to your point, that's the value of so much interdepartment work that has to inter and intra-department work. I mean, there is, when you're talking water supplies and needs and how you prioritize, you know, there's conversations, many conversations that I've had over the years with community development, trying to figure out which way, you know, we're going. Infrastructure was always important, trying to understand the infrastructure piece. How does that going to play out into the future? So none of these are intended to be the plan for the city. This is part of your learning process, and for staff, we need to be looking at, are we looking around the corners as best we can?
Leslie, are you about ready to wrap it up? We have a few more minutes.
Leslie, I'm sorry, Chair, can I just ask one question, kind of back to this? Do you have any idea of, are any of these wells, do we have information that would indicate that they're in need, or that they're, I mean, you kind of talked about the Bradshaw area where they're starting to kind of run into some challenges, but do we have any other ideas about any of these exempt wells?
The state keeps track, and so kind of the south side here, South Chino, has been known to start having some difficulties. I mean, some of this can go way back. This corridor has been known to be challenging for water supplies if you're working off of a well. I think that it goes back to understanding hydrology and geology. If you're working off a fractured system, which is what this is generally up here, fractured rock, once you evacuate it, you have to wait for the next snowstorm to come in. And so we would have calls over the years while I've been here where they're just like, wow, my well's gone dry. I'm like, yeah, we had a really dry winter, you know, and they've made it. And then now they're into summer and they're like, we're not. And I said, there was only so much the city could do to bring on people. So
Gotcha.
We do, I guess, is the short answer. So cranking ahead and wrapping up. The bottom line here is, and that's the last slide, is, you know, I hope this helps in your decision making. You're trying to develop a new policy. Sorry, we don't have recommendations today to say, yes, use this volume as what you can allocate from. Yes, use this biannual amount. Those are things that hopefully, after having time to think about this a little bit more, we can engage and talk through this and get you to a point where you want to be now. That's all I have.
Okay, well, thank you for that very comprehensive report, and I think I will call you our water watchdog from now on. Let me make a few points and summarize a few concepts. We were looking at the water budget policy 11, 12, and 13, and 14 today. And I'm a member of CWAG, and I've had some input from CWAG, and they definitely support the water budget. both for residential and commercial, and I do too. The reason why we support it is that it allows for planning, and it lets future businesses know that if they come here and relocate here, that we have planned for the water and we are managing our water. And it also will help us manage any future high water users. As you know, we have a high water user out at the airport who uses a half an acre foot a day. Their water bill is $40,000 a month. And we need to have some parameters on our commercial water use. We need to have a budget, an allowance, because we cannot afford to have somebody like a high water user come here, or have many of them attracted here, because we don't have a budget. And that would be very devastating to our managing and having a sustainable water supply going in for the future. So I was just wondering if Mr. Montoya and Mr. Shishka would weigh in on what their thoughts are on having a water budget for residential and commercial.
Well, I'll go chair and jump in and say that I do think that there's some useful capacity to planning. I think my biggest concern that I saw in the presentation that we just watched was sorting out what would be helpful for me to come up with a number in terms of what we're looking at is sorting out of the water service applications that were approved in the last couple of years, how many of those were for water commitments that already exist? And that doesn't seem entirely clear to me. So I'd like to see staff, and I imagine that's not an easy task, and so I apologize that I'm asking you to do something that's probably a little bit of a challenge, but I think it's useful because my guess is, and when I first came onto council, I sat down with Craig and Gwen and talked about this. My guess is that we're really not talking about a very vast budget because of all the commitments that exist. And so we're, in my mind, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw an annual water budget of less than 100 acre feet per year, or less than 75 or even 50. I would think that would be reasonable in my mind. But I think that people, and this comes back to a point that Councilman Sishka makes a lot, I think people might hear that number and get some sticker shock and be like, that low? Or maybe on the opposite side, you'll have people say, well, that much? I've had people say that they don't think we should have a water budget at all because they don't think we should be approving any other water because there's so much outstanding commitments. And I don't know that I'm necessarily on that point. But to me, I'd like to see less of an entanglement there so I can understand and really get my arms around. And I think that would be helpful for council at large, too, to just kind of have an understanding that. And Leslie, I would encourage you to forward the presentation on to other members of council, because one of the things that I think would be highly helpful is that we have the advantage of sitting here and having spent, an hour and a half listening to you and going through this. It would be a shame for you to come forward in a study session and a lot of the questions that Councilman Shishka or Mayor Pro Tem Rusing has asked, or I have asked, get asked again. So I would love to see the opportunity for other members of council to get kind of up to speed and briefed on this. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Chair. Contrary to what people may think, I don't have a problem with a water budget. I've lived under a water budget before as a young councilman.
When was that?
Yeah. But I think we need to do it right. As Councilman Montoya mentioned, what we ran into before when we had a low water allocation, or a low water budget, I'm sorry, I used the wrong words, was that people did think, oh my gosh, we're running out of water. Am I going to turn on the tap tomorrow and nothing's going to come out? Because we only have 50 acre feet left to allocate. So I think our communication skills have to be a whole lot better at really telling people what we're doing and why we're doing it. And,
Education.
Yeah, and I think that, just being an advertiser out in the market, you have to tell people over and over and over and over and over again before it actually sticks.
Consistent message.
Yeah.
The thing I would add to that, Councilman Rashevska, and I actually was talking to Mayor Kel Paguda in Prescott Valley about this yesterday, is I think it's a variety of ways you communicate the message. I think we can get, on the city level, we can get myopic and think, oh, well, we talked about this at the Water Issues Subcommittee, we talked about it at a council meeting, we posted on the website. That's not the only places people consume information. So I think, and this would be my message to staff as well, is we need to be as aggressive as possible to communicate what's going on in the community. And that looks like using social media. That looks like setting up town halls where, you know, maybe you have something at the adult center and you kind of run through this presentation again. And again, I know I'm asking staff to do a lot, and I'm sorry, but I think that's really important because people need to kind of be beaten over the head with this stuff sometimes.
Well,
Well, I think-
also, wait,
Oh, excuse me.
excuse me. We need to educate our elected public officials, and because we're the ones making the decisions for the community. Last night, I heard a campaign speech by a Prescott Valley town council candidate who grew up here, and she said, you know, I don't understand why other candidates make water an issue. I've lived in Arizona my whole life, and I've turned on the faucet, and we have plenty of water. What is the problem? And this is from one of our elected officials in Prescott Valley.
I just want to add one thing to add. I think that we need to have a rational basis for the budget that we come up with.
Science-based, data-based.
Yeah, and that's going to be kind of tough because, you know, there are a lot of emotional issues in this whole situation too. But I think that if we go to public forums and things like that, we have to justify why we're doing what we did.
Thank you. I'd also like to bring up another number, and that is how many projects are approved administratively, because that's an important number to include. And in 2021, there were 25 projects approved administratively, or 16 acre-feet of water. And this was during COVID. So I would like to ask if maybe we can get an average, you know, from like 2019 and prior, and see if we can get a number of, in the past, how much average we can expect administratively approved projects, because I was surprised that we had 25 projects approved, especially during COVID. And we also have to realize that the Yavapai Prescott Indian Tribe has potential water needs for industrial uses, and also our Chino Valley Irrigation District water allocation is also not just for residential, but it's for industrial uses. So I think we're about ready to wrap this up.
We
Is there
have a
any
public
public
comment?
comment? Thank you.
Go ahead, Mr. Mechanic.
Okay, thank you very much. And that was a very detailed presentation. I'm sure it gave us all some things to think about. One thing I wanted to cover, a couple of questions that came up. One was the history of workforce housing. And I just want to briefly say that even though there was a very big shortage of water that could be allocated, the fact that some was dedicated to workforce housing did not produce workforce housing. It wasn't enough. As someone mentioned, the property values are high, even higher now than they were 10 years ago when Mr. Lamerson suggested this program. So if the city is interested in any kind of workforce housing, it needs to have a full and open discussion how to do that. Because I know a lot of people have talked about it, but it hasn't been done. And I wanted to go back to the question of Big Chino reservations. those are not contractual commitments, except for the agreement with Prescott Valley. This is another issue that I've requested that the city have a discussion on the Big Chino project. There has been, I don't believe there's been a discussion in 10 years on the Big Chino project. Things have changed quite a bit. So I'd like to see an open discussion on the Big Chino project. As far as the contractual, we had an agreement with Deep Well, and that came up when the chair asked about can Deep Well, that Deep Well is not going to give back water. Well, I think Craig responded to that particular issue. They're restricted by a certain map, and they're restricted, excuse me, by the amount of water and the number of rooftops. They can't transfer that water outside their property. So it's not an issue of giving back water. They'll lose the water if they don't build that number of homes. So there is no contractual agreements that we have to live up to on the Big Chino, is my understanding. The agreement with Deep Well was that they would only get the water if the project was built and if the water was delivered.
Mr. Howard, I must caution you against giving legal advice to this body. I'm sorry, you're not an attorney, and that's just your opinion.
Okay, I'm giving my opinion. I'm not giving any legal advice. Let's be clear here. My understanding is that the agreement, and I could be corrected by the city attorney, my agreement was that the Deep Well would get the water if the project was built. Another question was brought up was about if we were taking over private water companies, and I had a question, if that happened, do we assume their water rights, or do we lose the water rights and have to use it off of our water rights? I don't think that was clarified. And the other issue I wanted to bring up was the chair brought up a CWIG policy that we need a commercial water budget in order to, for one reason, was given to be able to prevent high water users. And my understanding, and I could be corrected if I'm wrong, is even if we do not have a budget, council has the ability and to approve high water users. The city has for a long time had the policy that it does not want high water users, commercial high water users. And if someone comes to the city, that the city could turn them down, irrespective of a budget or not. Now, that's my understanding. I could be corrected, but that's my understanding. So I think it would be good, Leslie brought up these options
Please
as far
wrap it
as
up.
where water could go.
Mr. Howard, please wrap it up. Thank you.
Yeah. I would just suggest that the options that Leslie brought up about possible ways that water can be used in the future, that maybe they could be quantified so we can really see what we're talking about here is potential taking over wells or trying to go out into the forest or whatever. I think that would be useful to look at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mechanic. Any other comments?
No, that was it.
Okay. Do we have any general announcements from the staff?
Okay. From Kay Sito, your Water Resource Project Manager, she provided me with announcements related to SciTech Fest. That will be occurring this year virtually again. The city has provided water and wastewater videos. Former Mayor Mangarelli and Craig Dotseth did a tour of facilities that was also provided. The city has provided kits on water bottles, filters, donated dye tablets to check your toilet if it's leaking. And then Water Awareness Month is coming up in April, and the city will do its usual display at the library, and it's going to focus on rainwater harvesting projects and have a rain barrel in it, is what Kay wanted to provide to you today.
All righty. All right, thank you, and this meeting is adjourned.